Hey, good day there. This is Joe Van Cleve. Welcome to another Dead Tech review. This time it's the Lightning adding machine. Stay tuned. So you might recall that the previous video on this channel was about the Burroughs key-operated adding machine that I was given, and took me quite a bit of effort to clean up and get in proper working order, and it was very complicated mechanically. So just the next day I started thinking, oh my goodness, I remember when I was a kid and my grandpa had a hand-operated kind of an adding machine device, and I wonder if my oldest brother still had it. So I called him up this morning, and sure enough, he found it. So I got it from him temporarily. It needed to be cleaned and serviced. And so the way this works is you have a series of number dials, and it's very similar to a telephone dial. And you have little holes, and there's numbers around the edge corresponding to each hole, and you stick your ballpoint pen in the hole and spin it around until it stops, and that enters that number in here. And when you do addition, you just enter the next number, and the sum occurs automatically, and it does carry over mechanically to the next column to the left. And there are enough place values for your cents and your dollars all the way up to 10,000s of dollars. So this is calibrated in units of currency. And you can also do subtraction. It tells you to add, you dial the large figures clockwise, and to subtract, you dial the small figures counterclockwise. So the small figures are the complements of the large ones. So for instance, the complement of 7 is going to be the 2, etc. So they're using 9's complements, and so you simply, to subtract, you simply take the small number and dial it counterclockwise, and that does subtraction for you. When you're all done with your calculation, there's this rack out here, and you pull it and release it, and it clears all the calculations back to 0. And it kind of has this mechanical, metallic sound that reminds me of a firearm, a gun or something, you know. But this needed to be serviced. It was all jammed up, wasn't working very easily, and so I shot some video of how I took it apart and what's on the inside of it. Let's go take a look at that now. Okay, so when we turn it over, of course we have the felt padding on the bottom, but along both edges, the outer aluminum, the aluminum backing of the body has these little tabs that you can bend back, both on that side and on this side. And we're going to bend those little tabs back and try to open this thing up. Okay, so set that aside. So this is the back of the mechanism, and this linear rack gear is the clearing mechanism, and it engages these brass gears for each of the wheels. And you might notice that there is a flat area, or at least an area without a tooth on each one of these wheels. And along the linear rack gear, there's a space near each of the gears where there's an absence of a tooth, and that's intentional, right there and right there. And then these little arms right here have little springs on them. Those are the little pawls on the other side. I'll show you in a minute. And then this long spring is just the retracting spring for the erasing lever. So I'm going to go ahead and pry open the mechanism and pull it out of the body of the machine. Okay, I'm going to open this up. Now, first of all, the front of the unit is made of stamped aluminum, and it's painted and probably silk screened or whatever with these letters. And here is the heart of the mechanism. So you have each of the number wheels has the indicators for the digits, and then there is a little pawl arm. It's a rocker arm It operates kind of like the escapement mechanism on a pendulum clock, and it's spring loaded by the springs on the back side to click like that. And what happens is this little metal wheel next to it with the holes in it is the wheel that you use to dial your number. And so the way this works is each time you click it, the little arm of the dog is going to engage in this little wheel and stop it temporarily, and it gives it a little bit of a click feeling because of that. Click, 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 so you don't overshoot. Now this dialing wheel has a pin right here, and when it gets around to that far, it engages the tooth on the next wheel and causes it to turn one space. So let's try that again, like that. So the pin engages. So once you're done with your calculation, you pull this clearing lever and it clears all the numbers back to 0 on the top. Now, one of the things I noticed about this is if you set all of these wheels to the 9 position, which is where the little pin is ready to engage the next wheel to the left, if you set all of those like that, when you go to add the next number on the units column, it's kind of hard to turn because you have to turn all the gears at once. It's doing a massive carryover. But all the gears turn at once to do that. And then of course you have to clear it by pulling the rod, the lever, like that. Now obviously the little pin on this dialing wheel acts as the carryover. So once you've done 9 numbers, when you do the 10th digit, it does the carryover and increments the next wheel by 1 digit. So that's your carryover. And you might notice on the front panel it says to subtract, dial small figures the opposite direction, and the small figures are these smaller printed numbers which amount to 9's complements. So you're just doing the 9's complements in the opposite direction, and what's important about that is the fact that you can turn these wheels both directions. So you turn the wheel clockwise to add numbers, and you turn it counterclockwise to subtract numbers, like that. Now when I first opened this up, I noticed that there was a lot of graphite and dirt and residue from pipe tobacco and cigar tobacco and smoke, since my grandpa smoked. Anyways, I normally, because these parts, a lot of these parts are brass, I wouldn't oil them necessarily, but I did use a Teflon based gun lubricant and also some alcohol underneath these wheels to kind of flush out all the old residue, and sprayed it with silicone lubricant and kind of cleaned off the excess and blew out the excess and just tried to get all the residue and gunk out of there so these wheels turn nice and easy, and this thing will erase itself, clear itself better. And the same thing with this sliding erasing rack. I put a little bit of silicone spray underneath it, Teflon silicone spray, and then worked it back and forth, and then cleaned off all the excess. These little wheels are riveted to the dial wheel on the other side, and so there's a possibility of getting a lot of gunk in the shaft underneath there where you can't clean it out. So I had to spray some alcohol in these wheels and let it run down in behind it, and then blow it out with some compressed air, and just in general just clean it up. So we can do another erasure here. Now the front bezel was very dirty. It had a big film of yellowish brown smoke, and it cleaned up quite nicely. This is the way I remember it looking when I was a kid. So I'm going to put this back together. All I'm going to do basically is fit the parts in here and re-bend these little aluminum tabs back to put it all together, and then I'll set it back into its plastic resin holder case. So the mechanical chassis fits into the front bezel like this, and your tabs line up in the little slots. And then the back, which is also made of thin aluminum, kind of snaps in there, and then you want to just bend these tabs back carefully to seal it back up. And here we are with it all back together again, and it works very nice and erases very nice. I really like the appearance of this thing. It really looks cool. Now, I keep saying that you use a ballpoint pen to do the data entry, but thinking about it, now I don't really know the date on this, but ballpoint pens have only been around since post-World War II. There was fountain pens and pencils before that, and you wouldn't want to use a fountain pen on this, and a pencil would be too soft. It would break the lead every time you tried to dial a number. So I think it's possible that my grandpa either was using some hard tool like a punch or a scribe, or perhaps this came with something like a stylus. You'll notice if you look at the profile of this, of course it's sloped for the convenience of the user, but there's also this little ledge right here that conveniently enough will hold a pen of some kind, but I can imagine there might have been a stylus that came with this that was used, and I just don't have it, and I don't remember if it really if it ever had it, but it makes sense it probably did. And I could see getting a nice little brass hardware store punch and rounding the tip of it so it's not so sharp. It would make a nice little stylus for using this. Now, as far as an approximate age of this unit, there's no serial number, so it's hard to date it, but I know from looking a little on the internet, it appears that these were made anywhere from the 1920s up to the 1940s or maybe early 50s, so it's hard to say when this one was made, but suffice it to say that they obviously used something other than a ballpoint pen, because they were originally made before the era of the pen. So there was originally a stylus most likely that came with this, and I maybe could ask my brother to look around. He might find that stylus, but anyways, it's a cool little artifact. Now, one of the things I find really interesting about this adding machine is the dial operated number entry system. You have these round dials that you have to spin. You put a whole finger in the hole, just like a finger in the dial of a telephone, and you run it around until you hit the stop. And it's almost the exact same mechanism or design idea as dialing a number on a telephone. You run it around until your finger hits the stop and release it. So you can see where this came out of the telephone, the dial telephone era, this whole idea of dialing for number entry. Now, of course, another cool thing about this is you can actually remove the adding machine from the base. And the base is, I don't think it's Bakelite. I know this old telephone is Bakelite, but this is some kind of a plastic resin. A little bit smoother, and it looks like it was molded. And there is some kind of a imprint, IMG, some kind of a molding mark, maybe GMI. Anyways, very cool. And I think the thing that I really like about this calculator or adding machine, you know, it's not the most efficient device as far as number entry. It's not nearly as fast as that Burroughs key-operated adding machine. You know, you're just inputting little numbers one at a time. You can't input an entire number, you know, multiple place values simultaneously. You can only enter them one at a time. So definitely designed for balancing your checkbook kind of a thing, or financial calculations. So, you know, I'm sure an accountant, a bookkeeper wasn't using this kind of a device. It's just a little bit slower and clunkier than a real adding machine. But for the average person at home at the time, it was probably a lot less expensive, takes up less room, and it's a lot easier to use if you're not a trained accountant. When I think about these old mechanical devices like mechanical adding machines and manual typewriters, obviously these came out of an era where a lot of these devices were simply used, if you will, mechanical logic. This is before the era of electronics. But what I find interesting about it is how adding machines and calculators don't seem to have quite the attention these days as typewriters, and I think the simple reason is there's more you can do with language than there is with numbers. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean to disparage the field of mathematics, but the everyday person has more to relate to words than a string of numbers. Everybody appreciates money, and using an adding machine or a calculator to add up your wealth is a worthy cause. But I think in day-to-day, people are more likely to be interested in words and writing than they are in simply working with numbers. So I think calculators have kind of a limited appeal intrinsically. You know, there is a practical reason to balance your checkbook, but of course nobody has checkbooks anymore hardly, and nobody balances their accounts hardly anymore. Everybody trusts their bank. And so there's really less cause to have to use a calculating device these days, ignoring even the automation brought about by smartphones and online banking and all that. But I just think writing has a greater spread of appeal and usefulness than numbers. Maybe I'm wrong. Prove me wrong. Leave a note in the comments. Maybe there is something I'm missing, but I'm a number guy. I enjoy numbers and calculators. I remember back in the 1970s when the pocket calculator, electronic calculator craze first hit, there was a number of books on games you can play with your calculator, and I thought it was kind of fun to do that. And you know, I was kind of an oddball geeky kid at the time, but still today in 2017, you know, I enjoy these antique calculating devices I have, but really the typewriter is more useful for me from day-to-day uses. So anyway, that's the lightning adding machine from Los Angeles, California. This is a family heirloom of mine. My grandfather used it when I was a young kid. I remember seeing it around his house. He'd have it on the kitchen table. He would be doing his books with it. So very cool. I'm glad that I was able to borrow this from my oldest brother and get it fixed up a little bit, cleaned up and oiled and operating just like new. Well, this has been another Dead Tech review. And until next time, this is Joe Van Cleve saying you have yourselves a great day.